At a luxury auction in Houston, before hundreds of millionaires and raised phones, Sophia Whitmore pointed at a dust-covered red dragster and called it $500 of scrap. "Start it and it's yours." The room laughed. Daniel Brooks didn't reach for the key. He knelt, traced the throttle line, and found the main linkage rod had been removed long ago. He reached behind the driver's seat. His fingers touched cold metal bolted there for almost 60 years. A name was stamped into it. Sophia stopped smiling and left the stage. Daniel didn't yet know that what sat behind that seat could prove the Whitmore empire was built on a theft, a fire, and a man who died without his name. The August heat sat on the tin roof of Daniel Brooks's garage like something with its own weight. The fan in the corner turned and clattered and turned again, pushing around air that was already too warm to be any use. Oil stains spread across the concrete in shapes he had stopped seeing years ago, the way a man stopped seeing the walls of his own house. He was bent over the engine bay of a Buick that belonged to a schoolteacher named Charlotte Neely when he found what he had been listening for. A cracked sensor, $31 at the parts counter on Griggs Road, and a connector somebody had forced in backward at some other shop. $90, he told her, wiping his hands. "That's parts in an hour." She had the checkbook already open. "The dealership quoted me $1,100. They said the whole assembly." "The whole assembly's fine." He handed back the 220s she had pushed across the workbench as a deposit. "You don't replace a thing just because you haven't looked for the right piece yet." She stood there a moment longer than the transaction called for the way people did in that garage, then thanked him twice and drove off. On the desk inside the office, 2 envelopes from the bank lay unopened beneath a coffee cup Daniel used as a paperweight. He had known what was in them since the day they arrived. Reading them would not change the numbers, and the numbers had been the same since the winter his wife died, and the medical billing kept arriving for 11 months after the funeral addressed to a woman who was no longer there to receive mail. Emily had her summer workbook spread across the top of the old toolbox, the steel one with the rounded lid that had belonged to Daniel's father. She was 9, and she preferred that toolbox to any table in the house because from there she could see the whole shop. She had a page of long division and a problem she did not like. Daniel watched her out of the corner of his eye lift her right foot into her lap. The sole of her sneaker had come away from the toe. She reached into the second drawer without looking, took out the roll of electrical tape and wound it twice around the front of the shoe. She pressed the end down with her thumbnail, put her foot back on the floor, and returned to the page. She did not complain. She did not look up to see whether he had seen. Daniel turned back toward the Buick and stood there for a while with his hand on the fender. "Dad." Emily was holding up her pencil. "What's this one?" He came over and read the problem, and while he read it, she was already looking past him at the shape of a car under a tarp in the second bay. "Don't look at the dust," he said, tapping the tarp as he passed. "Look at the bones underneath. Everything else can be washed off." The flyer was taped to the counter at the parts store on Thursday next to a display of wiper blades. Whitmore Automotive, a Saturday auction glass tower on the west side. Cars Daniel would never touch, photographed from angles that made them look like jewelry. At the bottom, in type half the size of everything above it, project vehicles and liquidation lots. Bidding opens at $500. There was a photograph of the liquidation floor taken from too far back and slightly out of focus, and behind 2 rows of million-dollar machines at the edge of the frame sat something long and low and wrong for the company it was keeping. Daniel looked at it for a while. Then he took the flyer. The pickup made it across town on Saturday with the headlight on the driver's side, held in place by a zip tie, the same zip tie that had been holding it since March. He parked it in a lot full of cars that had never been rained on. "Deliveries are around the east side, sir?" said the young man in the valet vest before Daniel had fully stepped down. "I'm not delivering anything." The registration desk asked him twice whether he was certain he had the right event. The woman said it kindly the first time and then said it again, and the second time was the one that meant something. She looked at his boots and then out through the glass at the pickup and then wrote his name on a card. Inside the floor was marble, and the air was cold enough that Emily crossed her arms. A man in a linen jacket turned from a conversation, held out an empty champagne glass without looking, and let go of it, assuming a hand would be there. Daniel caught it. He set it down on the nearest table and kept walking. Emily saw all three. She did not ask him about any of it. She took his hand and held it tighter than she had a minute before. Near the pillar by the north wall, a woman in her 40s with a press badge and a camera she was not using watched the glass change hands. She had been sent to cover a society event and had spent 2 hours photographing paint. She wrote one line in a notebook, looked up again, and found the man in the work clothes already gone into the crowd. A security guard in his 60s, gray at the temples, straightened slightly as Daniel passed and gave him a nod. Daniel returned it without breaking stride, and it took him another 20 steps to place the face, and by then the man had turned back toward the doors. The liquidation lots were in the far corner past the lighting where the marble gave way to sealed concrete. The red dragster sat under a layer of dust thick enough to hold a fingerprint. A cardboard placard leaned against the front wheel. Provenance unknown. Daniel went down on one knee. The welds were laid by hand. He knew it the way he knew a voice on the telephone. The beads were even more even than most machines managed, but they had the small human variation that no machine ever produced. The frame rails had been bent, not stamped. The load was carried through a triangulation he had seen before in cars built a decade after this one. And on the underside of a diagonal brace, there was a bright patch where somebody had ground a mounting tab flat. Daniel put 2 knuckles against the firewall and knocked. It came back hollow. He held there half a second, then stood and said nothing about it to anyone. The guard found him 15 minutes later near the coffee urn where nobody was standing. "You fixed my grandson's Camaro," the older man said. 2 years back, $200. Dealer wanted $4,000 for the same job. Ray, Daniel said the name arriving finally. Whitfield. Ray glanced once toward the main floor and lowered his voice without appearing to lower anything. "That car in the corner. 2 of their senior engineers were on it all Monday morning. 4 hours with the lights and a lift camera." He turned his cup slowly in his hand. "That afternoon there was some shouting upstairs, in Miss Whitmore's office with the door shut, and that is not how that office runs. And Tuesday it was in liquidation. Tuesday morning it was in liquidation with a piece of cardboard leaning on the tire." Ray finally looked at him. "They don't push worthless things down here. They push down the things they want gone before somebody asks the right question." Daniel looked at the bidding paddle in his hand. Emily was watching his face. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to make them look." When Sophia Whitmore came to the liquidation lots on the big screen, she came to them the way a host comes to the part of the evening where the good wine is gone. "And now," she said, "the estate of somebody's grandfather." The dragster filled the screen, and the room made the sound rooms make. "Lawn ornament," Sophia said. "Yard art. This thing has been dead since before half of you were born, and I am told on good authority that it is worth exactly what it weighs. We'll open where we have to open. $500. Somebody put it out of its misery." Daniel stood up. The room turned all of it in one motion, and a room only does that once in an evening. Sophia looked at the work shirt and the boots. She looked at the child holding his hand. Then she looked past both of them through the glass wall to a pickup in the far lot with a zip tie on the headlight, and she made the calculation everyone in that room was making. "Sir," she said, and the microphone carried it beautifully, "do you know what you're buying?" "I might not know what it is," Daniel said, "but I know you don't want anybody else to find out." The engineering summary had been on Sophia's desk since Monday. She had read it 4 times. Engine will not rotate under starter load, probable seizure, throttle actuation incomplete primary linkage absent no replacement fabricated, vehicle non-operational without full teardown. 2 men with 30 years between them had put their names on that. They were right about every symptom and wrong about the cause, and neither of them had thought to reach behind the driver's seat, because nobody in 1964 had written down why anyone would need to. So when Sophia Whitmore leaned into the microphone, she was not frightened. She was enjoying herself. "Let's make it interesting," she said. "Start it, right here in front of everyone. Start this $500 drag car and it's yours. Free. I'll sign the title myself." The room came alive. "And if it doesn't start," she added, "you'll thank us for the entertainment and see yourself out." Her eyes went for less than a second to the third-row aisle seat, where a man in a gray sport coat had been sitting all afternoon without once lifting a paddle. Daniel looked down at his daughter. Emily did not ask him to win. She said, "You don't have to prove anything to them. I'm not doing this for them." He raised his hand toward the stage. "I'll need my toolbox from the truck." Something moved through the room, then a settling in of several hundred people who had come for cars and were now getting something else. Ray Whitfield went out to the lot without waiting to be asked. The toolbox came back in through the service door, steel-rounded lid older than every vehicle on the floor. Ray set it down on the marble in the open space in front of the dragster, and the sound it made carried farther than anyone expected. Daniel crouched and threw the two latches. They snapped open, one after the other, into a room that had gone completely quiet. Daniel did not touch the key. He took out a socket wrench, fitted it to the crankshaft bolt at the front of the engine, and leaned on it. The crank turned. It turned stiffly the way a thing turns when the oil in it has gone to syrup and sat that way through 60 summers, but it turned and it kept turning, and Daniel brought it around a full revolution, and then a second one while the room watched him do something that looked like nothing at all. Two men in the 11th row who had been laughing stopped laughing because they had spent enough of their lives around engines to know what that meant. Daniel pulled the plugs one at a time and held each one up to the light. The electrodes were worn, and the porcelain was stained, but nothing was cracked and nothing was fouled solid. He set them in a row on a shop rag, poured a capful of oil down each cylinder, and let it sit. The distributor cap had a hairline split running from one terminal down toward the base. He cleaned it, worked a bead of sealant into the crack with his thumbnail, and set it aside to skin over. Emily crouched beside him with the toolbox open across her knees. "1/4 inch, Daniel said. She handed him a 3/8. He took it without comment and held it, and she looked at it and then looked into the drawer and then took it back out of his hand and gave him the right one. The fuel tank was the problem he could not fix, only avoid. He cracked the line at the bottom fitting, and what came out was not gasoline. It was a dark amber varnish that ran like honey and smelled like something out of a paint locker. Daniel capped it off and stood up. "I need clean fuel," he said to nobody in particular, which in a room that size meant he was speaking to whoever would answer. Ray Whitfield came back 4 minutes later with a red plastic can from the generator shed behind the loading dock and a length of clear hose. He set it down beside the front wheel and spoke low only to Daniel. "Man in the gray coat, 3rd row? He's a scrapbroker out of Rosenberg. He's been at 4 of these. He only ever buys the things that are going to get cut up." Daniel rigged the can above the carburetors on a bracket he made from a piece of coat hanger wire and gravity, and it was ugly, and it worked. And a man in the 2nd row said loudly that it was a fire hazard, and Daniel agreed with him and kept going. Then he came to the battery, and there was no battery. There was a tray and a hold-down clamp, and 2 cables with the ends green and swollen, and nothing between them. Daniel cleaned the cable ends with a wire brush until copper showed. Then he stood, wiped his hands, and walked out through the main doors into the parking lot in front of everybody. His pickup was at the far end past the last row of cars that cost more than his house, with the zip tie holding the headlight. He opened the hood, took a 9/16 wrench out of his back pocket, and broke the terminals loose. The battery weighed about 40 pounds, and he carried it back across the lot with both arms and then across the marble, past the champagne tables, past the linen jackets, past the woman with the press badge who had stopped pretending to photograph paint, and nobody offered to take a side of it, and he had not expected anyone to. Ray held the door. Emily watched her father set the battery down in the tray and understood what he had done because she was 9 and not stupid, and the truck was how they got home. Daniel felt her looking. "One thing at a time," he said. He snugged the clamp, ran the cables, and touched the ends together for a spark test. It jumped blue. Then he swung into the seat, found the throttle pedal with his boot, and pressed it. It went to the floor with no resistance at all. Nothing pushed back. Nothing moved anywhere in the engine bay. Daniel got out and went forward and traced the linkage bracket with 2 fingers, and there it was again, the same bright patch he had found on the diagonal brace an hour earlier. A mounting tab, ground flat and smooth, the grinding marks running in one direction, deliberate, careful, done by somebody who had not been in a hurry. He straightened up. "This isn't broken," he said, and he said it loud enough that the front rows heard him clearly. "It was taken." Up on the stage, Sophia Whitmore leaned forward for the first time all afternoon. Daniel stood looking at the car and talked it out where his daughter could follow, which was also where the whole floor could follow. "Whoever built this did everything twice," he said. 2 oil lines to the same gallery, 2 ground straps off the block when one would do. There's a backup for the backup on the fuel pickup." He put his hand flat on the roll bar. "A man who builds like that doesn't leave one throttle linkage in the world. He builds a spare, and he doesn't put the spare in a drawer in his shop because the shop isn't where it breaks." Emily said, "Where does it break?" "On the track, where he can reach it." Daniel leaned across the cockpit and reached down behind the driver's seat. His fingers found cold metal. It was bolted to the frame tucked into the space behind the seatback 4 bolts, and it had been there so long that the paint had built up around the edges of it like sediment. He worked the first bolt free by feel, then the second. The third came out with the socket. On the fourth, he had to brace his shoulder against the seat frame, and when it let go, he lifted the whole assembly out into the light. It was a hand throttle. Not a factory part. Not a part from anywhere. A lever, a pivot, a rod, and a return spring, every piece shaped by somebody who had known exactly what he wanted and had made it because nobody sold it. The joints were still smooth. 60 years and Daniel could work the lever with 1 finger. Stamped into the flat of the lever arm in letters struck one at a time with individual punches, Falcon W. Hayes, 1964. An old man in the back of the room stood up out of his chair. He did not shout. He set it into the quiet, and the quiet carried it. Midnight Falcon burned, 1964, the car and the driver both. Sophia Whitmore came down off the stage. She left the microphone on the podium, which was the first mistake she had made all day, because the entire room watched her walk the length of that floor with nothing in her hands. She stopped 4 feet from Daniel and looked at the piece of metal. "Where did you find that?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment, he stopped guessing. "You're not afraid this car won't run," he said. "You're afraid it will." Near the pillar, Karen Diaz raised her phone and started recording, and did not lower it again for 11 minutes. Daniel set the hand throttle down on the fender. "Before I put this back on," he said, "I want you to say it again, all of it, out loud where everybody can hear you." Sophia's jaw moved. "If this engine starts," Daniel said, "the car is mine. No conditions added after. No revisions once you know what it's worth. Say that." 600 people were holding phones, and the phones were the reason she could not do anything except what she did. "If it starts," Sophia said, "it's yours, as stated." The man in the gray sport coat was already on his feet and moving toward the doors with a phone against his ear. Daniel bolted the hand throttle to the frame rail, connected the rod, and worked the lever until both carburetor butterflies opened and shut clean. Then he told them to open the freight doors. The floor manager said something about insurance. Daniel had already turned away from him and was talking to Ray. "There's no radiator on this car," Daniel said. "There never was one. It's got a 2-quart surge tank, and that's the whole cooling system because it was never meant to run longer than it takes to go a quarter mile." He looked back at this crowd. "If I light this in here, we've got a fire. And even outside, once it catches, I've got about 90 seconds before it starts destroying itself." That was the moment the room changed hands. 30 guests in evening clothes put their palms on a dust-covered drag car and pushed it, and it rolled on hard old tires across polished marble, past the lighting rigs, out through the freight doors, into the flat orange light of a Houston afternoon, and Sophia Whitmore walked behind it because there was nowhere else for her to be. Daniel chalked the front wheels with 2 blocks of wood from the shipping bay. He put the shifter in neutral and checked it twice, then rocked the car against the chocks with his hip. Then he lifted Emily into the driver's seat. He stood on the frame rail beside her, reached in with his left foot to hold the clutch down, and put his own hand over her small one on the key. "Turn it when I say." The first attempt gave them one dry cough and then nothing. The starter spun the engine over, and the engine did not care. Somebody in the crowd laughed a single bark of it, and Emily turned her head to find out who. Daniel touched her shoulder. "Don't look for him." He climbed down, primed the line by hand, and cracked the fitting until fuel ran clear and closed it. The second attempt caught. For most of 1 second, the engine fired and roared, and the whole car shuddered on its springs, and then it died. And that was the end of the laughing. Not because Daniel had won anything, but because the room had just heard a dead thing make a noise, and there is no coming back from that in a crowd. Daniel got out his feeler gauge and reset the points, and his hands were shaking slightly, and it was the only thing all afternoon that told anyone he was afraid. Emily counted out loud from the seat. "Third time." Before he reached in, Daniel put his palm flat on the body panel above the engine and said something that only his daughter was close enough to hear. "Whoever made you has waited long enough." He put his hand over hers. The engine did not start so much as arrive. The glass wall of the auction house rang in its frame. A champagne flute walked off the edge of a table by the freight door and broke on the concrete. Pigeons came off the roofline all at once. 600 people stepped back half a pace in the same instant as one animal, and the sound went on and rolled off the buildings across the lot and came back. Daniel did not celebrate. He stood on the frame rail with one hand on the roll bar and the other on his watch, and he counted. At 80 seconds, he reached in and shut it off. Thin blue smoke came up off the headers and slid sideways in the afternoon light, and the silence that followed lasted longer than the engine had. "It runs," Daniel said. Emily was crying in the driver's seat with both hands still on the key. Sophia Whitmore signed the title on the hood of a courtesy car in the loading bay because there was no other flat surface and her handwriting was not as steady as it had been at 11 that morning. She handed it over, and when Daniel took it, she spoke so that only he could hear. "You don't know what you just woke up." It did not sound like a threat. That was the part he thought about later. On the way out, he stopped at the cashier's window, took $500 in hundreds out of his wallet, and set the bills on the counter. The clerk told him the lot had been transferred at no charge and that there was no invoice to apply it against. "Then write me a receipt for $500 and put it against the lot number," Daniel said. "I don't take anything free from people who think I'm nothing. That's the price on the flyer. That's what I came here to pay." She wrote it out. He folded the receipt into his shirt pocket with the title. The pickup would not start. Daniel had known it wouldn't from the moment he broke the terminals loose in the parking lot, and he stood in front of the open hood for a while anyway, the way people do. Ray Whitfield came out at 7:15 with his own keys in his hand and a flatbed trailer he had borrowed from his brother-in-law for the week, and by dark they had the dragster strapped down and the pickup on a tow hook behind it. Emily fell asleep against the door somewhere on the south loop and woke up when they crossed the tracks near the garage. "Dad," she said, "what did you win?" Daniel watched the streetlights come along the hood of Ray's truck. "I don't know yet," he said. "But somebody knows, and whoever it is got scared this afternoon." The video went up that night, and by Monday morning it had been watched more times than Daniel Brooks could hold in his head as a number. He did not enjoy it. He turned the phone face down on the workbench and left it there, and it buzzed against the wood anyway, and Emily kept picking it up to read him things until he asked her to stop. He pulled the battery back out of the dragster before he opened the shop, put it in his own truck where it belonged, and drove the pickup down to Griggs Road to buy a second one for $62, because he had a feeling he was going to need 2 vehicles that worked. The call that mattered came Tuesday at 10 minutes after 8 from an area code out toward the Louisiana line. "Is this the man with the car?" The voice belonged to somebody old, and it was not steady. "This is Daniel Brooks. You said a name on that video." Breathing on the line. You held up a piece of metal, and you read the name off it, and you said it out loud so everybody could hear. Daniel put down the wrench in his hand. I'm the man who stamped it, the voice said. My name is Walter Hayes, and I've been telling people for 60 years that car burned, and I was the one who believed it hardest. Daniel did not get out to Beaumont that day because a silver sedan pulled into the garage lot at 11 and a man got out of it carrying a leather folder. He introduced himself as Gerald Pope and said he handled legal affairs for Whitmore Automotive, and he did not look at the shop or at the concrete or at the child doing summer workbooks on top of a toolbox. He looked only at Daniel, which was its own kind of insult. The number in the folder was written on the check itself, so there could be no misunderstanding. It was enough to clear both envelopes still sitting under the coffee cup. It was enough for a house on the other side of Highway 288 with a yard. It was enough that Emily would never fill out a financial aid form in her life. Daniel looked at it for a long time, and it would be a lie to say he wasn't tempted because he was, and the shape of the temptation was very specific. It was a strip of black electrical tape wrapped twice around the toe of a sneaker. He looked up. Saturday you people called it scrap, Daniel said. Today it's worth this. Explain the difference to me, and I'll sign it. Gerald Pope did not answer. He waited in the way of a man who has found that silence usually does his work for him, and when it did not, he closed the folder. Daniel pushed the check back across the bench with 2 fingers. At the door, Pope turned. You're a small man, taking a position against very large people. A man who has to buy my silence, Daniel said, isn't as large as you think he is. He drove out to Beaumont on Thursday with the Dragster on Ray's trailer. The nursing home had a covered walk and a lawn with the sprinklers running, and Walter Hayes was waiting under the overhang in a wheelchair with a nurse behind him. When they got the ramps down and the car on the grass, Walter put both hands on the arms of the chair and pushed himself up. The nurse moved forward and he lifted 1 finger and she stopped. He walked 17 steps. He did not touch the paint. He went past the nose of the car along the left rail to a place where 2 tubes came together at the base of the roll structure, and he put his hand into that joint on a weld nobody would ever see without lying on the ground, and he closed his eyes. Then he cried, standing up with his hand inside his own work. Later, they sat in the shade, and Walter turned the hand throttle over in his lap like a man handling a photograph. Everybody asks why it starts on the key, he said. Cars like this back then, you needed a push truck and 4 men and a track that would let you use them. We didn't have 4 men. We didn't have $4. He worked the lever with his thumb. So I built a car one man could light by himself in an empty shop at 3 in the morning because that was the only time we had it to ourselves. Gasoline. Ordinary pump gasoline. Everybody told us that was the amateur's way. He held the lever up. This I made for Buddy Callahan. He tore up his right hand in a wreck in '62, and he never told a soul, not the sanctioning body, not his own father. He'd sit there in the staging lanes with that hand in his lap like it was resting. Walter's mouth moved. I built him a throttle he could work with the heel of his palm. Bolted the spare behind the seat where he could get to it between rounds. Emily asked why the other one was gone. Walter looked at Daniel when he answered her. Because somebody wanted to see how it worked. The rest came out slowly over the better part of 2 hours, and none of it was complicated, and that was the terrible part. Walter drew the car and Buddy drove it. They ran it in 1963 and 1964, and it beat things it had no business beating, and men in better clothes started coming around the shop. Ambrose Whitmore came 3 times. He wanted the car, and then he wanted the car and the drawings, and then he wanted only the drawings, and each time the number went up, and each time the 2 of them said no. The 3rd time, Ambrose stopped talking about money. 2 weeks later, the shop burned at 4 in the morning with Buddy Callahan inside it, and the fire report said faulty wiring, and the car was written off as burned with him. 6 months after that, Whitmore Automotive introduced a chassis package with a load path that Walter Hayes had drawn on butcher paper in a shop on the east side of Houston. They told me it burned, Walter said. I buried my friend and I believed them for 60 years. Daniel sat with that. And then he said the thing that had been assembling itself in his chest since Saturday afternoon. Mr. Hayes, if the car didn't burn, then somebody moved it. And if somebody moved it, they moved it before that fire or during it. Walter Hayes looked out at the sprinklers on the lawn. Then the report is a lie, he said, all the way down. Daniel recorded every word of it, and that night he put the whole thing online without cutting a second of it. The man who came to the garage on Saturday did not shake Daniel's hand. He stood in the open bay in a work shirt with a utility company patch on the sleeve and let the silence go on until Daniel wiped his hands and turned around. "Marcus Callahan," he said. "Buddy Callahan was my grandfather." Daniel took a step toward him, and Marcus did not move, so Daniel stopped. There was no good answer to that, and Daniel did not try to build one. "Nothing," he said. "I haven't taken $1. I paid $500 out of my own pocket for that car, and I've got the receipt in the office. I've been offered a number that would have changed my daughter's life, and I sent it back across that bench on Tuesday, and I'll send back the next one, too." "That's easy to say." "It is," Daniel agreed. Marcus Callahan looked at him a while longer, and then he left, and Daniel let him go without another word, because the man had earned the right to not believe him yet. Whitmore Automotive issued its statement Monday morning, and it was better than Daniel expected, and that frightened him. The company said the throttle component was a fabrication attached to the vehicle by a man with an obvious financial motive. It said Walter Hayes was 84 years old in residential care and being led, and then it said the thing their lawyers had actually been building all week. If the vehicle truly was the Midnight Falcon, then it was property that had been declared destroyed and paid out under an insurance settlement in 1964. Title had never lawfully passed to anyone. Not to the seller, not to the buyer. The sale was void, the vehicle was disputed property, and Whitmore Automotive was petitioning to have it impounded and sealed pending resolution. Karen Diaz called Daniel from the courthouse parking lot to explain it to him, and she was almost admiring. "Do you see it?" she said. "Your own evidence is the reason they get to take your evidence." Customers began canceling. 2 on Tuesday, 4 on Wednesday, one of them, a man whose transmission Daniel had rebuilt at cost the previous fall. The comments under the videos turned, and a good number of them stopped being about cars at all. Daniel did not answer any of it. He drove Walter Hayes to a notary's office in Beaumont on Thursday afternoon with Karen there as a witness, and he signed the title of the Midnight Falcon over to Walter Hayes, surviving co-builder, for the sum of $1. "Now they can go take it," he told Karen on the sidewalk afterward. "But they have to sue a man in a wheelchair for it on television, and he's the one who built it." It was worth more than the check had been, and it cost him the only thing he had won. He called Marcus Callahan Friday morning and told him to come to the garage, and when Marcus came, Daniel handed him a cut-off wheel and a pair of safety glasses. "There's a panel behind the firewall on that car," Daniel said. "It sounds hollow. It's been welded shut since before either of us was born, and the men who took that linkage never opened it because they came for the parts they could see." He nodded at the tarp. "Your grandfather laid those welds. You cut them." Marcus stood holding the tool. "Why me?" "Because if there's nothing in there, I'd rather you saw it empty with your own eyes." It took him 20 minutes. The panel came away in one piece, and behind it was a cavity 9 inches deep, and in the cavity was a tin box wrapped in oilcloth and tied with wire. Inside were photographs of 2 young men leaning on a car with their arms crossed, engine drawings on butcher paper folded in quarters, and a spiral notebook filled front to back in pencil. Dates. The days Ambrose Whitmore came to the shop, and what he offered and what he said when the offers were refused. A page listing the specific systems he wanted. And in the last week of entries, 3 nights running a note about a sedan parked across the street with a man sitting in it who did not get out. The final page was written in a hand that was pressing much harder than the rest. "If this shop burns, it was not an accident. Whoever finds this, tell it for us. We were 2 guys who built something good and would not sell it." Marcus Callahan sat down on an overturned bucket and read it twice. Then he stood up and put out his hand, and Daniel took it. Emily came home from her friend Rachel's house on Monday and told her father in the voice she used for reporting things she thought were interesting that a man had been standing at the fence by the school parking lot asking Rachel what time her dad picked her up and what he drove and which days she rode the bus instead. Daniel asked her 3 questions and got 3 answers, and then something in him that had held for 17 days came off its mounts. He drove downtown. He walked into the lobby of the Whitmore building, past the desk and past the turnstiles, and Gerald Pope was coming out of an elevator with 2 other men, and Daniel said what he said in front of the receptionist and 4 security cameras. He used the words "my daughter" and he used the word "myself," and in between them he put a promise about what he would do with his own 2 hands, and the cameras got every syllable of it in clean audio. By the following evening, it was on 3 stations. Houston mechanic threatens auto executive in company lobby. They ran the 11 seconds and cut away, and the 11 seconds did not include anything about a fence at an elementary school. Karen Diaz watched it on the shop television with her arms folded. "You just gave them 10 seconds to erase 60 years, she said. "I know." He sat out on the step that night with the shop lights off behind him, and after a while the screen door opened, and Emily came and sat down on the concrete next to him and leaned against his arm. "You told me being scared doesn't mean you have to do the wrong thing," she said. Daniel did not answer her. He put his arm around his daughter and held on to her, and they sat there while the bugs came and went around the lamp over the door. In the morning, he did the thing he should have done in the first week. He copied everything, the notebook, the drawings, the photographs, the recording of Walter, and he put a set in Karen's hands and a set in Marcus's, and mailed 2 more to attorneys in Austin who had called him and whom he had not called back. The originals went into a safe deposit box on Griggs Road. Emily went to stay with his sister in Sugar Land, and she went without arguing about it, and that was worse than if she had. The board packet came to Sophia Whitmore on a Thursday, 2 days after the lobby footage aired, and by then she had stopped attending the strategy calls because Gerald Pope ran them better without her in the room, and both of them knew it. She read it in her office with the door shut. Litigation posture, media sequencing, a 1-page summary of the mechanic's finances that somebody had assembled from public filings, and 2 things that were not public. The last section was photographs. They had been taken with a long lens from across a street. A girl in a yellow backpack standing inside a chain-link fence at dismissal looking up at somebody outside the frame. The same girl walking to a car. A grid of times running down the right margin days of the week in the left column, Tuesday and Thursday circled. Sophia sat looking at that page for a long time before she picked up the phone. Gerald Pope came up and stood on the other side of her desk and did not sit. "Who authorized this?" she said. "The board authorized a comprehensive risk assessment." Sophia turned the page around so it faced him. "That is a 9-year-old child at a public elementary school. That is a witness in the custody of a hostile party." Pope said, "And the assessment does not require your signature. It hasn't for some time." He was still explaining the distinction when she stopped hearing him because she had gone somewhere else entirely into a hospital room 20 years earlier, where a dying man had held her wrist and told her what he had done and called it her inheritance. He had described a folder. That was the part she had never been able to put down. Not the fire. The folder. 2 men a shop on the east side, what time they came in and what time they went home, and a driver who sat in a sedan across the street 3 nights running. Ambrose Whitmore had sat behind a desk and read a document exactly like the one in her hands, and then he had made a decision, and a man had died calling for help through a door. Sophia understood 2 things in the same breath: that she had lost control of the things she had spent her life protecting, and that she was sitting in the chair her grandfather had been sitting in. The call came to the garage at 9:10 that night. She asked Daniel to come to the auction warehouse alone. He asked her why he should trust her. "You shouldn't," Sophia said. "You only have to listen to what I'm going to hand you." He went, but not the way she asked. Karen Diaz parked on the far side of the freight lot with the engine running and a 15-minute clock, and Daniel walked in with a recorder in his shirt pocket already running. The warehouse had no lights on the floor and no stage and nobody in it. The lighting rigs were gone. The marble ended at a painted line, and past the line it was sealed concrete, and Sophia Whitmore was standing on the concrete in the empty rectangle where a red dragster had sat under a piece of cardboard. She did not look like the woman with the microphone. She looked like somebody who had not slept since the third row emptied out. She told it plainly. Her grandfather set that fire himself. He had watched the shop for 3 nights, and he believed it was empty at 4 in the morning, and it was not because Buddy Callahan had been sleeping on a cot in the back to guard a car that was already gone. Ambrose heard him through the door, and he ran to his car, and he drove home. The Falcon had been taken out 3 days before on a flatbed by 2 men on his payroll, so the drawings could be measured off the machine itself. Afterward, it went into a company warehouse, and it stayed there moving from schedule to schedule as an inventory line for 6 decades. And when your engineers found it in that building, Daniel said, you put it in liquidation. I put it in liquidation, and I arranged a buyer, and I priced it at nothing, and I stood on that stage and told 600 people it was garbage so that nobody else would bid. Her voice did not break. Yes. Daniel had every opening a man could want then. He did not take any of them. Why didn't you crush it? He asked. 20 years. You could have put it through a shredder any Tuesday you wanted. She looked at the empty concrete. Because crushing it takes a signature, Sophia said. A disposal order goes into the asset file with a name on it, and it stays there forever, and one day somebody pulls that file. Her mouth moved without becoming anything. That's what I told myself. That it was procedure. I have never once been able to sign my name to anything with that car in the same sentence, and I have had 20 years to find out whether that was caution or something else, and I never did find out. Then she bent down and picked up a document box off the concrete and held it out to him with both hands, and it was heavier than it looked. Daniel set it on the fender of the courtesy car and opened it there in the dark. On top was a single sheet in fountain pen, in the hand of an old man with a strong grip dated 11 days before Ambrose Whitmore died, and it began by naming the street the shop had been on. Under that were the shipping records, a flatbed hauler, a company account number, a pickup address on the east side, and a date 3 days before the fire, with 2 employee names on the driver line and a counter-signature from an office that had ceased to exist in 1971. Under those were the drawings, and they were not Walter's originals, but tracings of them on Whitmore vellum with a Whitmore engineering title block dropped in at the corner and the load path unchanged in a single line. Under those was a canceled check from a personal account to a man who had been the deputy fire marshal for that district in 1964, drawn 9 days after he signed the final report in an amount that was almost exactly the balance of a mortgage he had carried until that month. And at the bottom of the box was a cassette in a paper sleeve, and beside it, printed on modern paper with a modern header, a chain of internal email in which Sophia Whitmore instructed 2 senior engineers that their findings on Lot 14 were not to be entered in any system, and instructed a facilities manager that the lot was to be transferred to liquidation and that no photographs were to accompany the transfer. Daniel read that last one twice. "You understand what this does," he said. "The rest of it buries a dead man. This one buries you." "I know exactly what it does." "Then why is it in the box?" Sophia Whitmore stood in an empty warehouse with her arms at her sides. "Because a folder like the one on my desk this morning is how all of this started," she said, "and because the name Whitmore has been said out loud for 60 years and the other 2 names have not. It's time people knew Buddy Callahan and Walter Hayes. What Karen Diaz did over the next 9 weeks was not dramatic, and it was the only reason any of it held. She took the notebook to a document examiner in Dallas who tested the paper stock and the graphite and put the entries inside a 2-year window ending in 1964. She found the deputy who had worked the fire as a young man and who had never stopped saying at family tables, and once to a reporter who never printed it, that the burn pattern started in 3 places at once. She found the first draft of the fire report in a county archive box that had been mislabeled by 1 digit since the Johnson administration, and the first draft used the phrase accelerant indicated, and the final one did not. And she matched 14 claims in the Whitmore chassis patents filed in 1965 against 14 pages of butcher paper drawn by a man who was still alive and could read them back to a camera line by line. By the time it published, none of it depended on a single person's word. It depended on paper that agreed with other paper. Sophia Whitmore was not charged with anything her grandfather did. Her attorneys never had to argue about a fire in 1964 because the state was not interested in it. She was charged with what she had done herself in the last 8 months as a sitting chief executive with directing the concealment and attempted disposal of material evidence after an investigation had opened, and with 2 counts arising from statements made to shareholders about the origin of the company's foundational patent portfolio. She pled to all of it. She did not ask for a reduction, and she declined to allocute against the board, which her own lawyers told her was the single worst decision she made that year. Gerald Pope and 3 directors were investigated separately on a matter that had nothing to do with cars arising from a set of photographs of a child taken with a long lens from across a public street. The 11 seconds of lobby footage ran again after that on the same 3 stations, and it played very differently. 6 weeks later, a national racing museum opened a permanent exhibit, and they put the name on the wall in letters a foot high. Callahan and Hayes, the 2 who wouldn't sell. They did not restore the car. That had been Daniel's one condition, and the curators fought him on it for a month, and then gave in entirely. The paint stayed checked and faded. The scratches stayed. The hand throttle stayed bolted behind the driver's seat, where Walter Hayes had put it for a friend with a ruined hand, and the cut panel behind the firewall was left open with a light in it, so you could see the empty cavity where the tin box had waited. In a case of its own, on a stand at the height where children looked at it, they mounted a piece of cardboard with 2 words on it. Provenance unknown. The museum put Daniel Brooks on contract as restoration consultant for 11 months at a rate they set without asking him what he thought it should be, and that was real work and real money. And it was the money that cleared the 2 envelopes that had been sitting under a coffee cup on his desk since spring. He never opened them at the bank. He opened them at the shop at night and paid them and threw them away. The patent settlement went to Walter Hayes and to the estate of Buddy Callahan. Daniel Brooks was not named in it, and he never asked to be. And when a lawyer in Austin explained to him at some length that he had a colorable claim, he thanked the man and said no. Walter and Marcus took a piece of what came to them and started a fund for a trade apprenticeship, and they attached exactly one condition to it, which was that Daniel had to be the one who taught it. Walter Hayes lived 11 more months. Daniel drove out and got him once a month and brought him to the museum, and Walter would stand at the rope with his hand on the frame rail and talk to whoever was standing there, and he only ever talked about Buddy. Not once in 11 months did he say the name Ambrose Whitmore out loud in that building. He died in the spring with a photograph of 2 young men and a car on the table beside the bed. The last thing he said to Daniel was, "You didn't just start the car, son. You put the 2 of us back into the world." Marcus Callahan had his grandfather's headstone recut that summer. The old one had a name and 2 years on it. The new one had a name, 2 years, and 1 more word underneath. Driver. Emily Brooks went to school in College Station and came back with a mechanical engineering degree and an offer in Fort Worth that she turned down inside a week. She runs the shop with her father now. She brought in the diagnostic equipment he had spent his whole career doing without, and he brought in 40 years of listening, and the arrangement works because each of them thinks the other one is the reason it does. In the corner of the front bay on a shelf above the parts washer, there is a small glass case with a child's sneaker in it, and around the toe of the sneaker are 2 turns of black electrical tape. There is no plaque under it. Apprentices ask about it every few months, and Emily tells them it belongs to her, and that is the entire answer they get. Years later, a new kid, 17, first week stopped in front of the photograph on the office wall, a man on one knee beside a red dragster on a marble floor in work clothes with a toolbox open beside him. "Is that the $1 million car?" the kid asked. Daniel Brooks was in his 60s by then, and gray through the beard, and his hands still had the same calluses in the same 4 places. "No," he said. "That's the $500 car." The kid looked at him. $500 was the price, Daniel said. The value was something nobody in that room had the patience to look for. Two different things. Learn the difference early, and you'll be all right. He tapped the wall beside the photo on his way past the way he had tapped a tarp in a hot garage a long time ago. Don't look at the dust. Look at the bones underneath. At the museum on a Tuesday afternoon in the quiet hour before closing, the Midnight Falcon sits under soft light with 60 years of wear still on it. Behind the driver's seat, the hand throttle is right where it has always been, and if you get low and look, you can still read the letters punched into the lever one at a time. A small plaque on the floor stand below the placard, in its own case, reads, "Recovered by Daniel and Emily Brooks, who looked closely." Sometimes what needs fixing isn't the machine sitting quiet under the dust. It's how fast people decide what a thing is worth and who before they have looked at it at all.